in the unforgiving desert of Arizona Territory, where the blazing sun carved deep lines into weathered faces and justice often came at the end of a gun barrel. One man's choice would forever change the lives of two people from worlds that were never meant to meet. This is the story of Kurt Morrison, a lone cowboy whose moral compass pointed true north even when the law pointed elsewhere. In 1880, when tensions between Apache tribes and white settlers ran as hot as the desert sand, Kurt faced an impossible choice: follow the law he'd sworn to uphold, or protect an innocent woman whose only crime was being born Apache. What happened next would test not just his courage, but his very soul. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Kurt Morrison's weathered face as he guided his chestnut mare through the rocky terrain of the Sonoran Desert. It was late September 1880, and the heat still clung to the landscape like a suffocating blanket. Kurt had been riding for 3 days straight, following cattle rustlers who had made off with nearly 50 head from the Johnson Ranch. As a deputy sheriff for Pima County, tracking down stolen livestock was just another day's work, but something about this particular chase felt different. Kurt was a man of 32 years, tall and lean from a lifetime in the saddle. His steel-gray eyes had seen enough of frontier justice to make him cautious, and his calloused hands told the story of a man who'd worked hard for everything he'd ever earned. Unlike many lawmen of his time, Kurt had learned to speak some Apache during his younger years, when he'd worked as a scout for the cavalry. That knowledge would prove more valuable than he could have imagined. As he crested a small ridge, Kurt's mare suddenly tensed, her ears pricking forward. Years of experience had taught him to trust his horse's instincts, so he immediately reined her in and listened. The desert was never truly silent. There was always the whisper of wind through mesquite, the distant call of a hawk, or the scurry of small creatures seeking shade. But now, carried on the afternoon breeze, came something else: the sound of men's voices, harsh and threatening. Kurt dismounted and led his mare behind a cluster of barrel cacti, then crept forward on foot. What he saw in the small canyon below made his jaw clench with anger. 3 men, clearly the rustlers he'd been tracking, had cornered a young Apache woman against a rock wall. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, and despite her obvious fear, she stood defiantly, her dark eyes blazing with courage. "Please," she said in heavily accented English, "I have done nothing wrong. I was gathering medicine plants for my grandmother." The largest of the men, a bearded brute named Jake Coulter, whom Kurt recognized from wanted posters, laughed cruelly. "Apache squaw gathering poison, more like. You people got no business being this close to white settlements." Kurt's hand instinctively moved to his Colt .45. He'd dealt with Coulter's gang before. They were wanted for more than just cattle rustling. Murder, assault, and worse were part of their repertoire. The woman was in real danger, and Kurt knew he had only moments to act. "We should take her back to Tucson," suggested one of the other men, his voice carrying an ominous undertone. "Sheriff Daniels would want to question her about the missing cattle." Kurt's blood ran cold. He knew Sheriff Daniels well enough to understand what questioning an Apache woman would entail. The sheriff was known for his harsh methods and his particular hatred of the Apache people. If these men took her to town, she might never be seen alive again. The woman, whose name Kurt would later learn was Aiyana, meaning eternal blossom in her native tongue, raised her chin proudly. "I know nothing of stolen cattle. My people do not steal. We take only what the earth provides freely." "That's what they all say," Coulter sneered, reaching for the rope on his saddle. "Come on, boys. Let's get her trussed up and head back." Kurt made his decision in that instant. 3 against 1 weren't good odds, but he'd faced worse. More importantly, he couldn't stand by and watch an innocent woman be brutalized. His conscience wouldn't allow it, law or no law. "That's far enough, Coulter." Kurt's voice rang out across the canyon as he stepped into view, his badge glinting in the harsh sunlight. "You and your boys are already wanted for rustling. Don't add kidnapping to the charges." The 3 men spun around, hands moving toward their guns, but Kurt already had his weapon drawn. "Easy now," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Miss, step away from them." Slowly, Aiyana looked confused but relieved. She had no way of knowing that Kurt was making a choice that would brand him an outlaw in the eyes of the law he served. All she knew was that this stranger with the kind eyes and the star on his chest was offering her protection. "You got no right to interfere, Morrison," Coulter snarled. "This here's official business. Sheriff Daniels wants all Apaches brought in for questioning about them stolen cattle." "Sheriff Daniels can question her proper-like in town, with witnesses," Kurt replied. "Not out here where nobody can see what happens to her." But even as he spoke the words, Kurt knew he was lying. He had no intention of taking Aiyana to Sheriff Daniels. He'd seen what happened to Apache prisoners in the sheriff's custody, and he wouldn't be party to that kind of injustice. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, each man calculating his chances. Finally, Coulter spat in the dust and holstered his gun. "This ain't over, Morrison. Sheriff's gonna hear about this." "I expect he will," Kurt replied calmly. "Now mount up and ride out. You're trespassing on Apache territory anyway." As the three rustlers rode away, hurling threats and curses over their shoulders, Kurt found himself alone with the Apache woman. She watched him warily, her intelligent eyes trying to read his intentions. "Thank you," she said softly. "But why did you help me? Your people and mine." "My people got nothing to do with it," Kurt interrupted gently, holstering his gun. "Right's right, no matter what color a person's skin is." It was a simple statement, but in the Arizona Territory of 1880, it was also a revolutionary one. And with those words, Kurt Morrison began a journey that would change both their lives forever. The desert evening was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as Kurt and Aiyana made their way through the winding canyons. She had agreed to let him escort her back to her people's camp, though Kurt suspected she had little choice in the matter. The encounter with Coulter's gang had shaken her more than she cared to admit, and traveling alone in the desert at night was dangerous even for someone who knew the land as well as she did. As they rode, Aiyana began to relax in Kurt's presence. His respectful manner and obvious concern for her safety gradually wore down her natural wariness of white men. She told him about her life with her band of Chiricahua Apache, led by her grandfather, a respected medicine man named Nailnish. "We are peaceful people," she explained as they paused to rest their horses near a small spring. "We follow the old ways, gathering plants and hunting small game. We harm no one, but still your people see us as enemies." Kurt nodded grimly. He'd seen enough of frontier politics to understand the ugly truth behind the conflicts. Fear and greed drove most of the violence, not any real threat from peaceful Apache bands like Aiyana's. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," Kurt said, offering her some jerky from his saddlebags. "Maybe if more folks on both sides were like him, we wouldn't have these troubles." Aiyana smiled for the first time since he'd met her. "He would like you, I think. He says a man's heart matters more than the color of his skin." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Kurt's hand moved instinctively to his gun as 6 riders emerged from behind a rocky outcrop. His heart sank as he recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Tom Daniels himself, flanked by 5 deputies. "Well, well," Daniels called out as he reined in his horse. "Deputy Morrison, heard you had some trouble with the Coulter gang today." Kurt stood slowly, his mind racing. He could guess what Coulter had told the sheriff, and it wouldn't be the truth. "Sheriff, what brings you out this far from town?" "Official business," Daniels replied, his cold eyes fixed on Aiyana. "That Apache woman is wanted for questioning in connection with the cattle thefts. I'll be taking her into custody." "On whose authority?" Kurt asked, though he already knew the answer wouldn't matter. "Mine," Daniels snapped. "And if you interfere, you'll be facing charges of your own." Kurt felt the weight of his badge against his chest like a lead anchor. He'd sworn an oath to uphold the law, to follow the orders of his superiors. But he also knew what would happen to Aiyana if she were taken to the county jail. Apache prisoners had a way of trying to escape, or resisting arrest, in Sheriff Daniels' custody. "She hasn't done anything wrong," Kurt said carefully. "I was there when Coulter's gang found her. She was just gathering plants." "That's not what Coulter told me," Daniels replied with a cruel smile. Says she was scouting for a raid on the Johnson Ranch. Says you let her go out of some misguided sympathy for savages. The word hit Kurt like a physical blow. He'd heard it used countless times, but never before had it made him so angry. He looked at Aiyana, who stood quietly beside her horse, her face a mask of resigned dignity. She understood enough English to know what was being said about her. She's not a savage, Kurt said quietly. She's a person, a human being who deserves to be treated with respect. Several of the deputies shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. They knew Morrison as a good man, fair and honest in his dealings. But Sheriff Daniels' authority was absolute, and crossing him meant losing their jobs, or worse. That's enough, Morrison, Daniels barked. Step aside. That's an order. This was the moment Kurt had been dreading since the confrontation began. He could follow orders, hand over Aiyana, and probably keep his job. He could tell himself that he was just following the law, that what happened after wasn't his responsibility. Or he could do what he knew in his heart was right, regardless of the consequences. Kurt looked into Aiyana's dark eyes and saw not fear, but a quiet acceptance of whatever fate awaited her. In that moment, he realized that some things were more important than following orders. Some things were more important than the law itself. No, he said simply. The word hung in the desert air like a gunshot. Several deputies reached for their weapons, but Daniels held up a hand to stop them. What did you say? The sheriff asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I said no, Kurt repeated, stepping protectively in front of Aiyana. I won't let you take her. Not like this. Then you're under arrest for interfering with official business and harboring a fugitive, Daniels declared. Boys, take them both. What happened next would be talked about in saloons and around campfires for years to come. Kurt Morrison, deputy sheriff of Pima County, drew his gun on his own fellow officers to protect an Apache woman he'd known for less than a day. It was an act of conscience that would make him an outlaw in the eyes of the law, but a hero in the eyes of justice. I'm sorry it's come to this, Kurt said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was doing. But I won't be party to murder, badge or no badge. Behind him, Aiyana whispered something in Apache. Later, she would tell him it was a prayer of thanks to the spirits for sending her a protector. At the time, Kurt was too focused on the 6 guns pointed at him to pay attention to anything else. You're making a big mistake, Morrison, Daniels warned. There's nowhere you can run where we won't find you. Maybe so, Kurt replied, but I can live with being hunted. I couldn't live with letting you hurt an innocent woman. And with those words, Kurt Morrison crossed a line from which there would be no return. He was no longer a lawman. He was an outlaw, and his only ally was the Apache woman he'd sworn to protect. The abandoned mine shaft where Kurt and Aiyana took shelter was a relic from the early days of Arizona's silver boom. Located high in the Dragoon Mountains, it provided excellent concealment and multiple escape routes. Essential qualities for 2 fugitives, with half the territory's law enforcement hunting them. It had been 3 weeks since the confrontation with Sheriff Daniels, and Kurt was beginning to understand the true cost of his decision. His face now appeared on wanted posters in every town from Tucson to Tombstone, with a $500 bounty on his head, dead or alive. The charge was treason against the territorial government, a crime that carried the death penalty. You should not have done this for me, Aiyana said one evening as they sat around a small, carefully concealed fire. Your life was good before. You had respect, position, a future. Kurt looked up from cleaning his rifle, noting the guilt in her voice. Over the past weeks, he'd learned that Aiyana carried the weight of others' sacrifices heavily. Her grandfather had taught her that accepting help came with the responsibility of being worthy of it. My life wasn't as good as you think, Kurt replied honestly. I spent most of it following orders, without questioning whether they were right or wrong. Maybe it took meeting you to show me what kind of man I really wanted to be. During their time together, Kurt had learned much about Aiyana's world. She was the daughter of a war chief who had died fighting the army, and granddaughter of Nailnish, one of the most respected medicine men among the Chiricahua. Her knowledge of desert survival had kept them alive when Kurt's law enforcement skills weren't enough. She had also shared the painful history of her people, The broken treaties, the forced relocations, the systematic destruction of their way of life. Kurt began to understand why many Apache bands had chosen to fight rather than submit to reservation life. "There is something I must tell you," Aiyana said, her voice troubled, "about why those men were really after me." Kurt set down his rifle, giving her his full attention. He'd suspected there was more to the story than simple cattle rustling. 3 moons ago, I witnessed something terrible," she continued. "I was gathering herbs near the Willow Creek settlement when I saw Sheriff Daniels and some of his men attack a family of Mexican farmers. They killed the man and his son, took their money, and burned their home. They did not see me, but I saw everything." Kurt felt his blood turn to ice. He'd suspected Daniels of corruption, but murder was something else entirely. "Why didn't you report it?" Aiyana gave him a look that was both sad and incredulous. Who would believe the word of an Apache woman against a white sheriff? "I told my grandfather, and he said we must stay far from white settlements until the danger passed. But somehow, Daniels learned that someone had witnessed his crime." The pieces began falling into place in Kurt's mind. Coulter's gang wasn't just looking for a convenient Apache to blame for cattle thefts. They were hunting for a witness to murder. And Sheriff Daniels was willing to kill anyone who got in his way. "He'll never stop hunting us," Kurt realized aloud. "As long as you're alive, you're a threat to him. Then perhaps it would be better if—" "Don't even think it," Kurt interrupted firmly. "We'll find another way." But privately, Kurt was beginning to wonder if there was another way. They couldn't run forever, and they couldn't clear their names without evidence that Daniels would never allow to see the light of day. For the first time since making his fateful choice, Kurt began to feel the full weight of despair. Their situation became even more desperate when a group of bounty hunters nearly cornered them near a water hole. Only Aiyana's intimate knowledge of hidden Apache trails allowed them to escape, but Kurt realized their luck was running out. "There is a place," Aiyana said as they made camp that night in yet another remote canyon, "beyond the border in the Sierra Madre. My people have hidden there for generations. We could live there safely." The offer was tempting. Mexico's rugged mountains could provide sanctuary that the Arizona Territory never would. But Kurt knew that running to Mexico would mean abandoning any hope of justice for the murdered farmers or clearing their names. "What about your grandfather?" Kurt asked. "Your family?" Aiyana's face fell. "I have not seen them since that first day. It is too dangerous. Daniel's men watch the reservation constantly." Kurt made a decision that surprised even himself. "Then we go to them. Tonight." "It is too dangerous," Aiyana protested. "If we are caught." "If we don't try, you'll never see your family again," Kurt replied. "Besides, I have an idea that might just get us all out of this mess." As they prepared to leave their mountain hideout, Kurt reflected on how much his life had changed. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a respected lawman with a comfortable future. Now he was an outlaw planning to infiltrate an Apache reservation to help a woman he'd come to care about more than he'd ever expected. But as he looked at Aiyana's hopeful face in the firelight, Kurt knew he'd made the right choice. Some things were worth more than comfort and safety. Some things were worth risking everything for. The question was whether his plan would save them all or get them killed. The Apache reservation at San Carlos was a dusty, windswept collection of government buildings and traditional wickiups, surrounded by barren hills that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. Kurt and Aiyana approached carefully, using every shadow and gully to avoid the army patrols that monitored the area. "The soldiers change guard at midnight," Aiyana whispered as they crouched behind a rocky outcrop. "My grandfather's dwelling is near the eastern edge, away from the main compound." Kurt nodded, checking his pocket watch. They had 20 minutes before the guard rotation. It would have to be enough time to find Nailnish and convince him to help with Kurt's desperate plan. The old medicine man was waiting for them when they slipped through the darkness to his simple dwelling. Despite his advanced years, Nailnish's eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing as he embraced his granddaughter and studied the white man who had risked everything to protect her. "Grandfather," Aiyana said softly in Apache, "this is Kurt Morrison, the man I told you about in my messages." Nailnish nodded slowly, then surprised Kurt by speaking in clear, if accented, English. "You are the one who chose honor over law. My granddaughter speaks highly of you." "Sir," Kurt began, but the old man held up a weathered hand. "Before you speak of your plan, you must understand something," Nailnish said. "The spirits have shown me visions of what is to come. There will be great danger, and not all will survive unchanged. Are you prepared for such a price?" Kurt felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. But looking at Aiyana, seeing the hope in her eyes at being reunited with her family, he knew his answer. "I'm prepared," he said simply. Nailnish studied him for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. "Good. Now tell me this plan of yours." Kurt laid out his strategy carefully. He'd realized that their only hope lay not in running, but in exposing Sheriff Daniels' crimes. But they needed proof, and more importantly, they needed witnesses who couldn't be dismissed or silenced. "The Mexican family Daniels murdered had relatives in Tucson," Kurt explained. "If we can get them to the territorial capital with Aiyana's testimony, and if we can find other witnesses to Daniels' corruption, we might be able to bring him down." "And how do you propose to travel to the capital with every lawman in the territory hunting you?" Nailnish asked. Kurt smiled grimly. "That's where I'm hoping you can help us, sir. I need to get word to Judge Harrison in Phoenix. He's one of the few honest officials left in the territory, and he has the authority to convene a special tribunal." What followed was the most dangerous week of Kurt's life. Using a network of Apache scouts and sympathetic Mexican Americans, they managed to gather evidence of Daniels' crimes that stretched back years. The sheriff had been systematically robbing and murdering isolated settlers, blaming the crimes on Apache raids to cover his tracks. The breakthrough came when Maria Esperanza, sister of the murdered farmer, agreed to testify. Her brother had written to her about suspicious activities by local lawmen shortly before his death, letters that provided crucial corroborating evidence. But getting everyone safely to Phoenix for the tribunal proved nearly impossible. Daniels seemed to have informants everywhere, and his desperation made him increasingly reckless. Twice, Kurt and Aiyana barely escaped ambushes by the sheriff's men. The final confrontation came on the outskirts of Phoenix itself. Sheriff Daniels, realizing that his crimes were about to be exposed, made one last desperate attempt to silence his accusers. He and 6 deputies cornered Kurt and Aiyana at a stage station just outside the city limits. "End of the road, Morrison," Daniels called out, his voice carrying a note of triumphant malice. "Judge Harrison won't be hearing any testimony today." Kurt stepped protectively in front of Aiyana, his hand resting on his gun. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but he wouldn't go down without a fight. "It's over, Daniels," Kurt replied. "Judge Harrison already has the evidence. Killing us won't save you now." "Maybe not," Daniels admitted, "but it'll sure make me feel better." The sheriff raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the distinctive sound of approaching cavalry filled the air. A full troop of U.S. Army soldiers, led by Judge Harrison himself, crested the nearby hill. "Sheriff Daniels," the judge called out in his commanding voice, "you are under arrest for murder, corruption, and abuse of office." What followed was swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of multiple witnesses, Daniels was convicted and sentenced to hang. His corrupt deputies were dismissed and arrested, and a new, honest sheriff was appointed to clean up Pima County. Kurt's charges were dropped, and he was offered his old job back. But standing in the Phoenix courthouse, watching Aiyana testify with quiet dignity about the injustices she'd witnessed, he realized his future lay elsewhere. "I want to work with the territorial government's new Indian Affairs office," he told Judge Harrison. "Someone needs to make sure what happened with Daniels never happens again." 6 months later, Kurt Morrison and Aiyana Nailnish were married in a simple ceremony that bridged 2 worlds. It was a controversial union in the Arizona Territory of 1880, but their love had been forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. As they stood together watching the sunset paint the desert sky in brilliant colors, Kurt reflected on the journey that had brought them together. He'd given up his comfortable life as a deputy sheriff, but he'd gained something far more valuable, a purpose worth fighting for and a woman whose courage matched his own. "Do you ever regret it?" Aiyana asked, as if reading his thoughts. Everything you gave up to protect me? Kurt pulled her close, breathing in the scent of sage that always seemed to cling to her hair. The only thing I regret, he said softly, is that it took me so long to understand what really mattered. In the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon, and the desert seemed to approve of their union. Two people from different worlds had found each other in the vast wilderness of the American Southwest, proving that love and justice could triumph even in the harshest of circumstances. Kurt Morrison had broken the law to protect an Apache woman, and in doing so, he discovered that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in following orders, but in following your heart. Their story would be told around campfires and in frontier towns for generations to come, a testament to the power of conscience over convention and love over prejudice. In the end, the lone cowboy had found something worth more than law and order. He'd found redemption, purpose, and a love that would last a lifetime. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.